Wallace Theological Seminary's Chapel Podcast.
Today I'd like to welcome you to our faculty forum. This is an opportunity for faculty members to talk about various current issues that are facing the church and culture from a biblical and theological perspective. And our topic today is, what are they saying about Jesus in the public square? And our forum participants are Darrell Bock and Dan Wallace. And what we plan to do is discuss this topic for 20 to 25 minutes or so, and then give you an opportunity to ask some questions from the audience. And you'll notice there's a microphone set up in each aisle. I'd like you to be thinking of a question that you would like to ask at the microphone on one of the aisles during that time. Let me begin by introducing you to some of the players who have challenged biblical and traditional views of Jesus and early Christianity in their publications. I'd like you to be acquainted with these names and publications a little bit, because we'll be referring to them along the way. A book by Bart Ehrman, Lost Christianities. Another one, Misquoting Jesus. Book by Elaine Pagels. This book actually was originally written in 1979, and interestingly enough has been reprinted just a year ago. Another book by Elaine Pagels, James D. Tabor, Marcus Borg and John Crossan. Another book by John Crossan, Earl Doherty, here's a volume that might be a good introduction to what current scholars are saying about the historical Jesus and early Christianity. Gowler's book summarizes and analyzes and critiques current influential portraits of Jesus. And then this is a publication press that reflects the work of the Jesus Seminar and some of the authors who are writing from that perspective. Now, you'll notice that all these books were written within about the last 4 years, and they deal with issues related to the historical Jesus and the origins of Christianity. Let me start with you, Darrell. Why the high interest in Jesus today?
Well, I think there are a variety of factors. Some of them have to do with the spiritual interest that just the pursuit of spirituality has in our culture, and that pursuit is kind of like a cafeteria. You walk in and you can get your religion in a wide variety of flavors, and Jesus is one of the Baskin-Robbins 31 flavors that you can get. And so there's curiosity at that level. There also is a movement among some to revise the understanding of early Christianity historically. And a lot of these works that you see that were posted are part of that discussion. There actually is a major movement that was a reflection of some things that were published in Germany in the 1930s. All good things come out of Germany. These publications argued that there was no such thing as orthodoxy in the earliest period, that what you had from the very beginning was a variety of Christianities. And so you're seeing that effort by scholars to actually move into the public square by producing a series of books that hit this theme in one way or another.
Good. Thanks, Joe. Anything to add there?
I always have stuff to add to Darrell's statement. Or detract from or something. I think one of the key players in the most recent interest in Jesus is Robert W. Funk. And the Jesus Seminar is something that he established in the early 90s. He assembled 84 scholars together to meet annually at least, and it was, I think it was a logistic nightmare for him to try to pull this thing off. And I asked him one time, I said, how in the world did you get these scholars together to meet? I said, it just seems like that would have been impossible. And he gave me a big smile and he said, it was nearly impossible, but it's also going to be impossible to duplicate. And consequently, what he was, could you not hear me until then? No. I can hear you. It was really profound, too, what I had to say. You missed it. That's the best shot I got this morning. I think I'm over with. Robert Funk was the reason. Are you sure you couldn't hear any of that?
They heard you.
Oh, okay. They did. All right. They say, we can't hear you, but we want you to shut up, so that's all right. So Funk starts this Jesus seminar and gets these scholars together, and he said it cannot be duplicated. He felt that any kind of responses to it by evangelicals and moderates would not be adequate because it's just 2 or 3 scholars, which I'm really leading into the IBR work that you're going to respond to, Darrell, here in a minute. But what Funk did was he turned biblical scholarship, especially liberal biblical scholarship, into something that the public square could understand. And the way he did this, I kind of think of him as the Cecil B. DeMille of biblical scholars. You know, Cecil B. DeMille was this guy who did all these great biblical themes, Cast of Thousands movies, that kind of thing. And what Funk has done is he had these beads, the colored beads that the scholars would put into a basket to show whether Jesus said something. Now, that was his idea of how to make this really understandable by the masses. And those colored beads, I've got a set of them that he gave to me. Red for Jesus definitely said this, black for he definitely did not, and gray and pink for somewhere in between. Those beads, all they were these wooden knobs that you put into inset holes where you put a screw into wood, and then you have to put an inset in there. And he just painted them, spray painted them in his garage. And those kinds of things are the things that captured the public's attention. What that book did, the 5 Gospels that Funk and the Jesus Seminar produced, was to bring biblical scholarship to a lay level and get people to be interested in Jesus, but a different kind of a Jesus than orthodoxy is taught. And I think that had a huge catalyst effect on so many other books that we're seeing now, 10, 12 years later.
Dan, it's easy to say that these attempts to make Jesus simply a great religious figure is just part of the spiritual battle that Christians have always had to face over who Jesus is. What do you think? Are there some historical factors that sort of drive these attempts?
I think there's, Darrell actually addressed some of these already, but let me address just a couple more, and I'm sure you want to add or detract from what I say after that. I think the archaeological finds, the Dead Sea Scrolls, where you've got some parallels to early Christianity, and in particular the Nag Hammadi codices, with the Gospel of Thomas as the most important manuscript along those, the Gospel of Judas that was recently published, this Gnostic document. Now you've got some people who are seeing a different Jesus in these early documents that were written by the people who held to a different Jesus, rather than the comments by the ancient church fathers who criticized them. That's creating a great amount of interest, and of course with National Geographic and their promotion of the Gospel of Judas, it created a great amount of interest in a different kind of a Jesus. I think, frankly, there's another thing that is driving a lot of this, and it's a phrase that Darrell has coined, so I'm going to steal from you, Darrell, and feel free to do the same to me later. Rigid fundamentalism. That is, that there's a fundamentalism that has grown up so that people hold to a certain view of what orthodoxy is, how we should read the Gospels, how we should interpret who Jesus is. And often what happens is we have such definitions of things, especially theological convictions, that are out of touch with what the Bible really does. So that when someone breaks that definition and shows that it's dead wrong as far as the scriptures are concerned, that fundamentalism shatters. And with it goes all the hopes in this view of Jesus. Now, when that happens, that person moves from his disillusionment to still wanting to salvage something about Jesus. And consequently, that's where we get most, if I'm not mistaken, most of our theological liberal scholars who have come out of fundamentalism or out of evangelicalism. Dan Kimball's recent book, They Like Jesus But Not the Church, kind of exemplifies this attitude. He's an evangelical emerging church pastor out in the Bay Area. And Kimball is saying, they like Jesus. We're not sure what kind of Jesus they like, but that needs to be our entree to talk to people. But most people don't like Christians, and partially because how the media has represented it. But Jesus he's a big seller now. But which Jesus it is the question.
Yeah, the image that I use actually is a picture, and it's talking about brittle fundamentalism, and that's the picture of the breaking or the shattering that happens. If you go to the first chapter of Craig Evans's book, Fabricating Jesus, he has a series of biographies about the people who are doing this kind of writing of the various books that you saw up on the screen. Virtually all of them come from conservative homes. Robert Funk came from a conservative home. Bart Ehrman came through evangelicalism. Elaine Pagels grew up in a Lutheran pastor's home. And so many of the people who reacted when they were young asked questions, asked difficult questions, direct questions, and were basically told, don't go there. And in their reaction, they came to view that there were no answers and no responses, and this created what I've called a brittle fundamentalism. There are a couple of other factors that I think are very important. Some of them positive, some of them negative. One of them is that if you study the history of Europe, and this is important because of the university connection to religious studies. If you study the history of Europe, particularly from, well, you can start with the Crusades and move all the way through into the period that led to the Enlightenment, there are a series of religious wars that literally ransacked Europe. And Europeans came to the point where they said, if this is where religion takes civilization, we don't want any part of it. And that's what fueled the Enlightenment, which raises the question about how the church gives its testimony to the culture and how it functions in the context of disagreement. So that's one factor. That factor goes way back. Another factor that I think is at work is that our culture has a God, and that God is the God of diversity. In other words, that what we want is a variety of views out there, but let's not get into the question of whether any one of them is more truthful from another, because that creates too much societal chaos, and people can't handle those differences, particularly in an area as sensitive as religion. So there's a push for diversity, and this leads to the third point that I want to make, and that is, and Dan's already alluded to this, the difference between Jesusianity, what I'm calling Jesusianity and what we're calling Jesusanity, and Christianity. These are the two stories that are in the public square. Christianity is the idea that the person of Jesus is at the center of what God is doing. It's what you and I are familiar with. Jesus is the Messiah. He's the Lord. You can't get to salvation without going through Him in terms of His person. But Jesusanity is something very different. Jesusanity has a respect for Jesus. It communicates a respect for Jesus, but it's His teaching that matters, not His person. And most cultural presentations of Christianity, and that clothe themselves as Christianity, are in fact Jesusanity. And Jesusanity is not the biblical Christ. And so that distinction is very important when you hear these conversations going on in public, because people will communicate a terrific respect for Jesus who hold to this Jesusanity, but it's not the Jesus of the Bible.
In light of what you said, do we need a different kind of apologetic approach today in our culture in responding to these alternatives?
Yes, I mean, I think that the days of simply doing evidence that demands a verdict and works like that don't get the job done. And the reason they don't get the job done, basically, there are two. One is that there are too many people who so completely reject any evidence that you bring directly from the Bible that you've got that hurdle to get over before you even start to have a conversation. So how do you do it? I think what you have to do is to begin to examine some of these alternate paradigms and ultimate models and deconstruct them. If they can do it to us, let's return the favor for a debate to be named later. And in that process, I think you can examine inconsistencies in the alternative positions. That's not normally done because most conservative Christians don't know alternative positions well enough to know how to deconstruct those paradigms and those models. So that's one element. The second element is that some of the material that is coming forward, and the thing is, it's not just coming out of academic universities, it's coming in documentaries, it's coming in books, it is on the net, it's all over the place. All this material is being presented to people in the public, sometimes going directly to the public, and it uses very technical levels of both Old Testament and New Testament study. People who write as lay people about Old Testament and New Testament study usually don't have the expertise to be able to address the question at the level the academics are presenting it that fuel all these views. All the people who you saw on the screen teach at well-known universities across this country. They have given their lives to the study of this area. And the idea that a layperson who's been a journalist in the past or has been with a parachurch ministry in the past can simply come and collect old citations and address those questions, doesn't recognize that the questions that are being posed in many cases are new or newly formulated or based on materials that have been in the public square no more than 50 years. So all of that is very, very important in dealing with these kinds of questions. It does call for a new kind of apologetic.
That leads us to look at a few excellent responses to erroneous claims and viewpoints that both of you have been working on in this area. And I'd like to call attention to a few of these responses and make you aware of some material that's available. These three authors are DTS grads. Of course, Dan Wallace is here. Darrell's book by Craig Evans, book by Ben Witherington, and another book by Ed Komachevsky and his co-author Robert Bowman. Both of you have worked on Dethroning Jesus. We saw that title a little while ago. Dan, why that title and what specific issues did you tackle there?
The title is, I think, meant to be provocative, as so many of these titles are, but to perhaps by the title let somebody know that, well, what's going on here? Has Jesus been dethroned? Are you dethroning Jesus? The subtitle gives kind of a sense of where we're going with it. But I think there's an awful lot of popularity right now to use gerunds in title, like misquoting Jesus, fabricating Jesus, dethroning Jesus, reinventing Jesus. And I hope we're going to retire it here pretty soon, go with some different styles. But I think this adequately explains it, that as Darrell explained, you've got Christianity versus Jesusianity, and Christianity has Jesus on the throne. Jesusianity does not. And so the picture on the cover is where Jesus is walking away from the throne, and he's walking away from it simply because the Jesusianity crowd doesn't see him there. He's not the one through whom we reach God. He's the one who teaches us about the kingdom of God, who teaches us about God, who teaches us about ethics, but he himself and his person is not particularly that significant. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we would go with that title. Frankly, I like this title a lot.
What issues did you deal with in the book?
Nothing, just the title.
Okay. That explains why it's thin on the front end. Darrell, how about you? What?
Well, I didn't deal with anything in the book either.
Okay.
So what we did for this book was to take 6 books or topics that have hit the bestseller list in the last 5 years. The thesis of each of these works we think is problematic, but it's been sold to the public, and a lot of the public have bought these books, have read these books, and in many cases have bought these theses. And so what we have done is tried to go through a point at a time, and a book at a time, a topic at a time in some cases, and deal with the various issues that these books are raising in a way that also reflects the kind of new approach to apologetics that we were talking about earlier, where you're deconstructing the model that's being presented on the one hand and dealing with the nitty-gritty data that is a part of that discussion. It isn't an easy book to write because you're trying to write it to people who may not have a whole lot of academic background. That makes it difficult, particularly when you're trying to deal with someone else's position. But it is a necessary book to write because unless you deal with the issues that are presented by the other position, you really don't engage and critique what's going on. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to produce a book that you can hand to anybody and they can work through an understanding of the issues that are represented by these 6 different books.
I might mention that the book will be out this coming November, is my understanding. Moving forward a little bit, Dan, you're the director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. How does your work in working with New Testament manuscripts relate to the study of the historical Jesus?
Well, I think it relates to it at a very primary level in terms of, are the documents that we have reliable in the sense of going back to what the original text said? Not in terms of whether the original text was right or not, but just in terms of whether the original text is saying the same thing that our copies of the originals have. And in particular, in the one of the early chapters we took on Bart Ehrman, who has, he's one of the best New Testament textual critics in North America, and he has recently come out with his book, Misquoting Jesus, where he argues that we're not sure what the original text said, but we're fairly sure the original text did not affirm the deity of Christ. And those kinds of conclusions are a little bit shocking to most people, and frankly are even shocking to other textual critics. But what we've tried to do is show that through a confluence of evidence, this is not something that was created later on. It was not something created in the 2nd century or 3rd century, but it had to go back to the original manuscripts. And we talk about the existing textual variants and how no fundamental doctrine is affected by any of these viable variants. Now, we have thousands upon thousands of differences among the manuscripts, and yet no essential doctrine is impacted by any of these viable variants. I think that's an astounding thing that, gee, if I didn't know better, I'd chalk it up to the providence of God.
Thanks, Dan. Darrell, you belong to the IBR Jesus Studies group. Tell us what IBR is and what you're working on and how it's going.
Institute for Biblical Research is what it stands for. It is made up of Old Testament and New Testament scholars who sign on to a confessional statement that is either inerrancy or infallibility. So this is a group that includes a spectrum that runs from Fuller Seminary on one end to some of your key Bible colleges that you're familiar with on the other. And what we did is we asked a group of scholars to come together, and we've been doing this for the last decade, meeting for a weekend every year, taking 12 events that we think we can defend on what we call an all-comers basis. Tie one arm behind my back, we'll play by your rules, and we still think we can show that 12 events related to the historical Jesus can be defended as historical. Each person who is a member of this group has done technical writing in New Testament studies. They come from a variety of schools. I'll give you the names in just a second. And we went through these events one at a time in essays of 40 to 60 pages each on each event. We literally went through these essays a line at a time together as a group and tried to make these articles as strong as we could. In 2009, these essays will be published together in a series in the Wundt series, which is out of Tübingen. It's one of the most respected international series in the world. It's a major historical Jesus work. Off of that will come a paperback version that Erdman's will publish a year later. And off of those two works will come a popular work that Bob Webb and I are the conveners of this group. We chair it. We'll do a work together that's aimed at a popular audience to summarize the results. So this is a major work. I don't think there's ever been as concerted an effort to bring together the entire spectrum of evangelicalism, both, if you might want to think of it, leftist evangelicalism and rightist evangelicalism, put it together in one functioning body and have it work. And this has been a very interesting exercise. The people who are participating in this include names that you'll recognize. Craig Evans, Scott McKnight, Grant Osborne, Mike Wilkins, Craig Blomberg, Howard Marshall, Klein Snodgrass, who teaches at North Park with Scott McKnight, Brent Kinman, one of our grads who did his degree at Cambridge. As I said, Don Hagner at Fuller, who is the George Ladd Professor of New Testament there, just retired. So every one of the people writing has done technical monograph work in New Testament and has been and has the credentials to address the guild with this. The goal of the work is not so much the people that we're in debate with now. Their minds are pretty much made up. The goal of the work is to take the next generation and let them look at a discussion that lays out the case for what the historical Jesus could look like on the basis of these 12 events. 6 of the events come in the general ministry of Jesus, and very importantly, 6 of those events come in the last week of Jesus' life. The reason that's important is one of the books that you saw, the Crossan and Borg book, is entitled The Last Week. It goes through the last week of Jesus' life, a day at a time, making a case for a political and non-spiritual Jesus, at least in the way we think about spirituality. And it's a Jesusianity portrait of the last week. So 6 of these studies are going to touch on several of the events that Borg and Crossan themselves raise in this book.
Good, thanks, Darrell. You do a lot of media interviews. What makes Christmas and Easter such significant events in the news cycle in this area particularly?
Well, everybody can take a deep breath because we're approaching October. And every year at Christmas and every year at Easter, you get a major set of Bible stories coming out of Newsweek, Time. You get the series of specials that hit the media. One of the things that's happened is that we've gone to a 24/7 history media niche in our culture. Just look at the National Geographic Channel, the History Channel International, the Discovery Channel. All these television stations need 24/7 programming. And at Christmas and Easter, their 24/7 programming usually deals with religion. And they either recycle the major primetime specials that other networks have done, or they produce new material themselves. And the news magazines look for fresh stories about what's recent about the Bible, and usually they go to the universities for that information, and when they do it, it usually is a story about how we have to look at the Bible very differently than we have at the past because of the new finds. And so Christmas and Easter are the 2 parts of the year when this happens. We've had our 8-month break, and now we get the 4 months of intense examination. So you can anticipate this Christmas and this Easter, some other news story will come up that has caught the attention of the press. And actually, publishers look to release this material in this time frame because this is when people's interest turns in this direction because of the holiday seasons that they represent. So you can look for Christmas and you can look for Easter, and when Dan and I don't show up in class because we're doing interviews, it's because Christmas and Easter has come around.
Before I ask Dan if he has anything to add, if you have a question that you would like to address to Dr. Bock or Dr. Wallace, just feel free to step up to the microphone in the aisle. You can line up a couple of people at a time if you wish, and be happy to have you address questions. But Dan, anything to add to what Darrell's just said about Christmas and Easter?
Just a bit, yeah. I had a student years ago who, after his master's degree here, went on to Oxford University to get his doctorate in Old Testament. And while he was in the middle of the program, I saw him at the Society of Biblical Literature one year, and I asked him, how are you doing? How have you changed theologically? How have you stayed the same? And he looked at me with a pained look on his face, and he said, I don't even know if I can embrace the uniqueness of Christ anymore. And it was a kind of a situation where he felt, I think, as if he had been let down by evangelicals because we've sometimes create a culture of fear, and we need to wrestle with these questions. He still wanted to believe in Jesus. He wanted to have something that he could salvage about Jesus, but it was getting chipped away so much. And so to this day, now he will not even take evangelical students at the major university where he teaches at. I think during the Christmas and Easter season, there's a heightened interest in Jesus Christ, regardless of the Jesus that people believe in. And it's analogous to what my kids did when they were little. We've got 4 boys, and one of our boys, when he was about 3 or 4 years old, was just talking about Santa Claus just before Christmas, and it just driving his older brothers bats. And so one of the brothers, Ben, looked at him and he said, "Zach, Santa Claus is dead." And it just kind of demolished his world, But I think that's part of what the mentality is here. So that at least got him to be quiet about the whole topic. But there's interest in who Jesus is, and people want to salvage some kind of respect for him, even if they may not be able to worship him anymore because they bought into Jesusianity, and Christmas time is the time to do that.
And I think the important part of Dan's story here is, and the important thing to appreciate when you enter into discussion with people is that people do have a respect for the person of Jesus Christ. What they have trouble understanding is the level of exaltation that the church gives to Jesus Christ in Christianity. Because they say, if we were to create a hall of fame, we put Jesus in it, he might even be in the first room. But it's still not the unique Jesus that we're talking about, that Christianity talks about. And that's the hard pill that a culture of diversity has to come to grips with in talking about Jesus Christ.
Good, thanks, Darrell. We have a question here. I'll start on the left aisle and ask your question, please, and keep it brief.
Okay, morning. I'm studying to enter the pastorate, and so my concern is for the local church and how this popular belief is going to affect it. Would you say that it is vitally important in the area, or for the pastorate and Bible teachers to focus on the area of Christology, and in order to, educate the local church on what the Bible has to say about Jesus?
It isn't merely Christology, and this is very, very important. It's a great question. It isn't merely Christology. What is required of a pastor today is not only that he know the Bible, but he knows what's going on around the Bible, because all these discussions are about what's going on around the Bible as a way of trying to take the Bible out of the conversation. So it's really, really important. This is where things have changed. It's really, really important that a pastor not only understand his Christology, but he's got to understand the historical, cultural roots of where the Bible came from, and the historical, cultural roots behind the chain of transmission that has the portrait of Jesus that we have in the Bible. So it's not just in the Bible, it's around the Bible, and that's very, very important, and that's where generally we've been lacking.
Darrell, you wrote the foreword to this book, Putting Jesus in His Place. Why do you call it not your typical book?
Because it does deal with these themes that move towards the portrait of Jesus, so we understand why it is we can trust the material that we have in the Bible. You know, what we will do is we will say, well, it's inspired. You know, God wrote it and that's it. Unfortunately, that's not good enough for your neighbor. And although that's true, let me play the card of the doctrine of the depravity of man on you. Why should we expect someone to have a high view of the Bible who, because of spiritual blindness, is struggling to understand who Jesus is? So the question is, how does the Spirit use us in our testimony in such a way that we open the door of the heart to consider who Jesus is and what's going on in the Bible? And part of that has to do with some of the issues that are raised here. And I happen to believe, and I think Dan does, and Ed Komashevsky, and this is why I wrote the foreword, does, that there is a good, logical, rational explanation. It may not be completely, that sounded modernist, but that isn't how I mean it. But there's good, logical explanation for how the Bible came to be put together, what the nature of that transmission is that tells us that we're back in the earliest period of Jesus, and certainly have different transmission routes than Gnostic Christianity, etc. Those arguments don't require, in many cases, any plea to inspiration that the person you're talking to doesn't accept. And so you will get into a very interesting conversation if you're prepared in that area. So that's why it has to be more than Christology.
Good, thanks.
Let me add here that I think in our culture today, with as much influence as we're getting from Muslims and interaction we're having from Muslims, they make the same kind of claims for the Quran as we would for the Bible. And so we say, well, I don't believe that. And so you get somebody who is not a Christian who says, well, you Christians are saying the same things. Why should I believe what you're saying? We have to have more arguments than this is what the verse tells me in 2 Timothy 3:16. I think the other thing is, since our culture is now getting exposed to a more liberal Jesusianity, and people are very savvy, they're aware of this kind of thing, we have to be aware of what's going on as well. Rather than just say, let's just preach through the scriptures, let's recognize where culture is coming from and how they're dealing with these things and how we can respond to it.
Okay, there's a question here on the right.
Is anything being done in terms of offering the historical Jesus class to a master's level in order that we can actually interact with the methodologies of Crossan and others?
The short answer to that question is yes, and stay tuned. It's being worked on. And there is in the works for the seminary some initial thought being given to how to do this and how to do this at the master's level. And my only hope for you is that we do it quickly enough that you'll be able to be a part of it. But yes, it's being discussed.
Well, you could add the gospel narratives course. It's an elective, but they can get into those issues there.
Yeah, but I don't like self-promotion, so thanks, Dan.
It's a good question.
You can pay me afterwards.
It's a good question. We are considering Jesus studies kind of concentration in the academic ministries track, so stay tuned. Another question.
If this assorted Jesus identity becomes pervasive within the evangelical community, what will the church look like? And also, the second part of that question would be, how close are we at turning the tide at the scholarly level to counter this movement?
Two excellent questions. I think the first half of the question is, you don't have to look very far to see what it would look like, because I think there are many churches that have gone this direction with regard to Jesus, and you can see what the product of those communities is. As far as stemming the tide, it's actually pretty interesting. There is, in Jesus studies, what's called the third quest. The third quest for the historical Jesus is a quest that finally has the discussion rooted in the right place, and that is how Jesus emerged out of Judaism, and what his Jewish roots are, and what the connections are between Jesus and Judaism, as opposed to the first quest, which tried to strip away what it called the doctrinal layers on top of Jesus, and the second quest, which started primarily with Hellenism. And so many evangelicals are participating in this third quest. In fact, the IBR project that I mentioned to you is really a third quest kind of project. And there are many of the monographs that are being produced about the historical Jesus today are coming from third questers who have evangelical roots. Is the tide being stemmed? No. What you're going to get, I think, is a perpetual debate. The perpetual debate's going to exist between those for whom high Christology means a unique Jesus, and they will never accept a unique Jesus. And the other will be those who will argue for some form of exalted Jesus, some form of a raised Messiah who's at the side of God and who is important to God's plan personally. And that's where you're going to see the evangelicals, I think, gather. So, and it's also, the other thing that's happening is producing a model showing that this kind of scholarship is doable from an evangelical point of view in a way that engages the entirety of academic discussion, even if it is to criticize it.
Let me add, if I can. I think that one of the problems we've got is that the evangelical community at large has moved from viewing Christ in terms of transcendent terms more towards immanent terms. And that is, we see him as a friend rather than as a sovereign Lord. I think it is both of those, but you get a picture of this when you see the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, the movie, or you read the book, where the children view Aslan as a friend, and yet he is someone to fear, to revere. And I think that's the kind of an attitude that we need to have towards Christ. If you've seen the movie Dogma, and of course you wouldn't admit that you've seen the movie Dogma because it's a terribly blasphemous and really funny movie, but you've got George Carlin, who is a bishop at a church, who says we're going to reconstruct how we view Jesus because we're losing people in our parish. And so he unveils this statue of Jesus, and he's got a thumb going out like this, and he's winking an eye, looks like the fawns, and he's calling him the Buddy Christ. And this is the way in which the church wanted to move. This is the kind of a thing that's going to cause people to move right into Jesusianity, because that's not the kind of a one we could worship.
I want to piggyback on the question one other thing, because there's a tone of it that I want to address. And that is that the fact is that evangelicals need to take some of the criticisms and issues that are raised about Jesus seriously. This isn't just a case of taking the newest stuff and saying it's all bad. There's some stuff there that needs to be sorted through. And one of the dangers that happens in this discussion is it creates a polemical environment in which there's a hard left and a hard right, and there's very little discussion about what's going on in between. And part of sorting this out, this kind of a discussion out, is nuancing the discussion by interacting with the details in such a way that you see what's being presented that is a reflection of the historical realities on the one hand, and yet on the other hand are able to see how the church did an excellent job of putting that portrait together and presenting Christ in the midst of it. Chris?
One more question.
Yeah.
Very fortuitous to walk into the chapel this morning and see you guys sitting on stage. Great interview on KERA from what I heard of it on Wednesday. My question goes toward the background, especially with these documents. Thomas, for instance, shows a reflection of the mystery religions, or sort of a Christian mystery religion, whether or not you want to call that Gnosticism. which influenced the cultural milieu around the first century, let's say. Fast forward to our day today, where we're sort of arguing about the same thing. Was Christ the only deity, or were there sort of a pantheism of deities out there of which Christ is one? Are there plans, or is anyone going to interact with sort of these secret societies or things which are involved in our culture today, maybe that are lesser known about, which seem to influence or at least purport sort of any sort of God form, as long as a non-exclusive God form that may then infiltrate the mindsets of Americans without them even knowing it? And is the forefront of the debate possibly there rather than over involving only the exclusivity of Christ with other people that seem to be Christian?
That's a great question, and I think it's a combination of things. It's, if you go on to the net and you Google something like Gnosticism, you will find all kinds of unusual things there. It's amazing. It really is. And so, yes, there are these discussions that take place in the context of the net. I think that one of the things that people have to think about is how they address the conversations that are taking place on the net that have nothing to do with the formal media, because that's where some of these discussions are taking place. One of the things I'm doing right now is I do blog, and we're going through this book, The Jesus Puzzle, and I think John's going to allude to this in a second. But in interacting with that book, which gives 12 points as to why Christianity was a myth in the beginning, and then it became a historical religion later, people concocted it into a historical religion. There's a lot of work being done, or a lot of groups that are being appealed to that do this kind of background work on the net. In fact, the publisher of this book, the Age of Reason Publications, is not, Erdmans or Zondervan or someone like that. And what it reflects is that there are blogs like, I think the Delirious Infidels or something like that. What it reflects is a conversation that's going on in public across the public airwaves that you never see on network television. Some people are going to have to engage that world, and then there are going to have to be resources put together to help people engage that world as well. And that's where our publishing attention has turned in the last 5 years, is to begin to supply some resources that can do that.
Good, thank you. Our time is fast concluding. I want to make mention to you of another event for some input on this important topic that will take place on Monday, October 29th at Fellowship Bible Church in Dallas from 9 in the morning until 4:30 in the afternoon, entitled Jesus in Prime Time. And Darrell will be involved in that, as well as Ben Witherington and others, and Dan as well. There is a discounted rate of $25 for DTS faculty, staff, and students, and pre-registration is required for this event, and registration closes on Friday, October 19th. So if you're interested in pursuing this a little farther and getting some additional input on this important topic and in this important area, that would be a great opportunity for you to take advantage of.
John, one of the interesting things about this particular day is that we have brought in media people who present religious specials on Jesus, both on the net, on the radio, on television, including people from such groups as CNN, Anderson Cooper 360. We have the person who does the religious producing for that show. We have a gal named Deborah Caldwell who actually runs the Christianity desk for BeliefNet.com. So this isn't just an academic day. This is a day to talk about how Jesus is being presented in the public square, and to ask people who are headed into ministry, how do I deal with the fact that Jesus is being presented in these kinds of ways, and what can I do in the context of ministry to help my parishioners or the people in our pews be prepared to deal with what they're going to see day after day, week after week, month after month.
Good, thank you, Darrell. And you can go to the website and get additional information and registration information as well. Let's thank Darrell and Dan for their contribution.